Thank you for tuning in to this week's Oregon Minute. This week we are interviewing Harry Hawkins, who was newly appointed to the Police Commission. How are you, Harry?
I'm doing good, thank you.
And so you are the Executive Vice President of Nehemiah, as far as I understand.
That's right,
Yes.
that's correct.
Okay, so what brought you to wanting to pursue a term with Oregon's Police Commission?
Well, a few months ago, in 2019, I had the opportunity I was invited to speak to the Oregon community at the Firefly. And while I was preparing for that talk, where essentially I was giving some advice, some tips, some ideas about how white people and non-black people were concerned about some of the racial injustice that African Americans were facing, particularly here in Oregon. When I was kind of giving them some tips and talking with my coworkers about that, my boss challenged me. He said, you really need to become a part of the community. So my family, we've been here since August of 2012. And so I hadn't really joined anything. Part of that was my wife and I, we were in process for a home. And as you know, the real estate market in the greater Madison area is a bit of a race. So finding the house you want and being able to get it is a little challenging. But at this time, we were serious about finding a place in Oregon. And when my boss said, look, you can challenge other people, but you also need to be involved. Mm-hmm. And so from that point, I began to try to figure out how can I participate? How can I be more involved? How can I get to know the community better at large? And how could I serve?
Mm-hmm. So tell me, it seems that presentation, I remember when we covered it mm-hmm. at the Observer, would it be accurate to say that was sort of the catalyst between, your getting more involved in the community? So can you tell me some things that you brought up at that particular presentation?
Sure. So I remember I was nervous because I met with the Oregon Allies before, and they were talking about some of the issues they had with the police chief and the police department, and they were talking about some of the action they were taking, and being a black guy in a small town, taking action against the police wasn't necessarily something that was high on my list. And that's not to say anything against the police department. It's just one of those things that typically maybe you want to think about twice before you do, because there could be pushback. So I was nervous about that. And then public speaking always brings a measure of uncertainty and a little bit of fear. And so I remember my boss has this eloquent way of saying what I kind of forgotten, made a very simplified version of. But what essentially I ended up with was telling people to learn, give, do. And my boss, the way I was supposed to say it was educate, affiliate, and donate. And so I couldn't remember the fancy way to say it. I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So I came away with the learn, give, do. And essentially it was learn about, the issues that are facing our country and our community. And I say that are facing our community, not just African Americans, but these issues affect all of us. One of the best examples I have, unfortunately, is our current opioid epidemic. If we had treated heroin addiction and other issues like that 30, 40 years ago when they were hitting African American and Hispanic communities as a social health crisis, then now, 30, 40 years later, we would have policies, practices, systems, funding, organizations in place to help rural communities as they're going through some of the same struggles. But instead, a lot of rural communities are scrambling to find the help and the support they need to deal with this, heartbreaking epidemic that's ravaging their communities. And so the idea was we need to learn about that history so we understand how we're connected. The other piece was to give to those groups that are doing something, because even if you're a great person, you're one person, you can't do it all. You need other people working on that. And then once you learn about those things and you've donated, then you can begin to go out and do some of those things. Find a way that's meaningful and that you're passionate about. So that was kind of what I talked about, but it was also kind of something I had to look in the mirror and say, okay, well, I've learned, I donate, but what am I doing?
Mm-hmm. So, and during that presentation as well, or I think it was that same presentation, you talked about your experiences as an African American man
mm-hmm.
in the community. Would you mind sharing some of what you shared.
Sure,
during that
sure.
presentation.
One of the things that I shared was how things that we don't always find a connection for, like colonial law, for instance, right? Like, does that really impact anyone's life today? Well, I gave one example of how I was playing Pokemon Go early one morning. And I know that looks a little weird because it's Pokemon Go, so if you don't know what people are doing, you know, like, why are they just standing there staring at their phone? But anyway, it was about 5:45, 6 in the morning, and I am standing playing this game, and an older white woman walks up to me and says, "I just have to know, what are you doing?" And I explained it to her, you know, just because I really wanted to hopefully let it be a learning situation for her, that really there's nothing going on. But that's not a burden that black people should have to take, and that everyone or no one should feel that they should feel obligated to answer or respond to that. But what happened was, in the past, it was written into laws in many of the colonies that if you saw a black person out at a time that was odd, that any white person had the authority and should, really the responsibility, to go and ask them, "Let me see your papers. What are you doing out here? Right? Are you up to no good?" And so I'm pretty sure if I told this lady she was being racist, she would have shut down on me and told me how great she was, how much good she's done, without even realizing that that level of policing black bodies and black lives was something that had become normalized to her, where she could do something that egregious and still hold on to her righteousness, or still hold on to her good-naturedness. And so that was one of the things I shared. And then I also shared with some of our white men in the audience. I said, you know, if you don't like the idea of being summed up because your ethnicity and your gender, I said, welcome to being a black man, right? I said, there are a lot of people who, when they see me, they fear me because of what they've heard or what they fear, without knowing me, without even understanding anything about me, my culture, or my family. And so I know that a lot of white men feel attacked right now, but a lot of it has to do with history and the things that have gone on. And although it's unfair to not be judged as an individual, it's a reality that I have to deal with every day. And I think that people are strong enough to deal with that, and we can move forward together.
I like that answer, and I appreciate your candor there. That can't be easy. And so, so can you tell me a little bit more about your background, what you bring to this commission position? Obviously, you being the executive vice president of Nehemiah, but you're a part of some other organizations in Oregon.
Yeah, so I am, my education is really connected with business administration, organizational behavior. So answering the question, why do people do what they do at work? So a lot of that is just group dynamics and people. And so when you're talking about how does culture exist in a space, that's what I craft, that's what I do, that's what I deconstruct if it's negative. And I've done that successfully in some way, shape, or another over the last 15, 20 years. So I also bring the community perspective of a non-white person. So I bring that to the table. And I'm also involved with the Oregon Diversity Commission and the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, excuse me. And working with that to really bridge the gap between the village board and the community, like Oregon allies and other citizens who are concerned about some of the things they see in the community.
So what goals do you have for your term that expires in 2025? And what do you hope to accomplish?
Well, one of the first things I would like to do is find a way to bring more transparency to the process. I actually had someone call me earlier this week because they had an issue with the police and they wanted to issue a complaint. And I was like, great. I said, but this is not how this works. Like, there's a process you have to go through. And so it wasn't that it was bad that they reached out to me, but people don't understand what the police commission does.
And that was going to be my next question, and is what, for those who maybe don't have the greatest understanding of what the commission does in Oregon, what does the police commission do?
Well, the police commission, as governed by the Wisconsin state law, really is going to be concerned with hiring, firing, and promoting of the police staff. So that includes chief on down. If there's a promotion or there's a hiring or firing or some corrective action, the police commission is going to be involved in that. And so there's a process, a complaint procedure that someone has to go through before it comes before the commission. And typically then you have the chief's recommendation that of which action needs to take place, and the commission essentially will either approve or deny that request.
And how often does the commission meet?
They meet as needed. So just recently we were looking at approving job offers for 2 candidates and offering a promotion to another candidate. And so it's whenever the need arises.
Okay. And so when you said you want to bring transparency, and in past interviews, I wrote a story about your appointment a few weeks ago. And when we talked then, the words we used were accountability, transparency. What might that look like?
Well, one, I think, just from a very simple standpoint, just sharing the process that the police department goes through to make its hires. So, for instance, I learned during this last meeting that we had that the Oregon Police Department does a ton of background research on their potential candidates. Social media accounts that they go over with the candidate. They talk to spouses and neighbors, right? And so the list was extensive. So sharing that might bring someone in the community a little bit of solace. Okay, they're not just hiring somebody off the street who says, I want a badge and a gun. At the same time, as far as some of the change I hope to bring, I noticed that in all of the background checks they did, there was nothing that required people to dive into an officer's potential bias. So now I don't know what that test might be, right? That's not my background, but just bringing that up and say, hey, I noticed here's a gap, because at work, one of the things I do is implementation. So implementation specialist, and so I'm looking at point A, point B, how do we get from here to there, and noticing, okay, well, here's a gap, here's a hole. And so bringing up that sort of point says, okay, well, yes, you do a great deal of background, but here's an area that you might need to do something else. And so then if somebody says, great, well, then we have to get the village board involved, because now we're going to be talking about some sort of fee for a test or money. And, that means a budget increase. And so then you have to go to the community and let them know, hey, look, here's why they're getting this budget increase. Here's what they're spending it on. So really just creating more understanding of what's behind the scenes and the process, how those complaint procedures work. If someone gets a complaint, who is responsible for that? Where does it go? How does it get to the commission? And how can people get involved with those processes as well? And I think as far as the accountability, one of the things that I think has to be voted on by the village board, but the village board can give the police commission the ability to audit police purchases. So for me, anytime I'm looking at an organization and I want to know what their priorities are, I always want to see their budget, right? Because whether that's a person or an organization, what's important to you will become very clear when I see where you're spending your time and your money.
When you brought up the word bias, and that word has, I think, based on everybody's understanding of the word, has various connotations. But it's very complicated, but it's very simple at the same time. So what is bias?
Well, in a simple term, is really the unconscious ideas that you have that really inform your decisions. So, for instance, one of the best examples and worst examples I can give, I'll use myself. When I first came to Madison, I was a hiring manager for a jewelry company here in town, and I hired somebody, and I found out later on that they were a gamer. So am I, and I'm thinking, well, that's cool. And then the next person I hired was a gamer. I'm thinking, man, that's a sweet coincidence. Another gamer. And then when it happened the third time, I'm thinking, okay, now this is a pattern, right? There's no way that this is a coincidence. Like once, cool. Twice, that's odd. 3 times, well, we're seeing a pattern here. And for the life of me, even though I know I did it, I cannot figure out how I figured out these were gamers. We didn't talk about video games in the interview. I asked people the same questions every time I do an interview, and it was part of our training, right? As HR representative, you have to go through and make sure you're not having bias. You can show that I've asked everyone the same questions. You have to keep that paper for 5 years. So I had paperwork to show that no, I don't have any bias in my hiring, and yet here was the proof right in front of me that somehow, some way, I had found this connection with people that made me think, hey, this person's all right. And to this day, I can't figure it out. But even though I can't figure out what my bias was, I was able to put systems in place to check that bias. So from that point on, I always had somebody interview with me, whether they were listening or whether they interviewed them as well. I always included more people in the process to make sure I checked my bias, because maybe I thought, man, this person's going to be great. And they go, yeah, no, I didn't like this, and this. Oh, now that you bring that up, okay, that makes sense. And so when we talk about bias, I think people get stuck on the idea of being racist, and racist means bad. And so really when you think about our world, you don't have to necessarily be a bad person who thinks something bad about someone and then act on it. You can just have an idea that you adopted because that's the water you're swimming in. And when that happens, then you are also a victim of racism as well, and don't even know it, because you've been fed these ideas, you've been fed this series of actions, and you act on them. And so for me, bias is not about labeling somebody, because whether or not you consider yourself a good person or a bad person, don't care. Really, it's about understanding that we all have some form of bias, and how do we take care of that? Now, if you're talking about just an average citizen who is at home and they're just doing their job, they might have bias, but that bias may not weigh in on someone else's life, liberty, or their rights. So although it's important for that individual citizen to work on their bias, it's imperative that the police forces here in Oregon and everywhere also address that need to create systems and processes and training to identify bias, but also processes to counteract that.
I think that's all of my questions, Harry, but I'm wondering while we're here, is there anything else you would like to address?
Yeah, I think so. Over the last year or so, I've had a chance to have a number of conversations with police in different departments across the Madison area. And one of the things that I've heard from them is that they want to be seen as people. They want to be seen as human. And it's difficult to do the work. And I think one of the things that has really been a disservice to both the police and the community is the rhetoric that there are two sides and the police and the community are on different sides. The reality is the police and the community should be working together. If you have a police officer who's not following the laws or the rules and they're doing something that endangers the community, we should get rid of them so that the police officers that are left can maintain that high dignity and honor. And the community also needs to be protected from police action that may be unlawful or unjust, or not even just unlawful, but just things that have negative impacts, if that makes sense. And so I think the most important thing is to realize that most people in the community want police officers to be safe, be able to do their job and go home. Most police officers want the same thing. But the reality is, in our nation, in our history, we have taken money away from social services, mental health services, so many social programs to militarize the police in some cases or spend that money elsewhere. And now we have police officers who are dealing with things that they were not trained for, that they can't handle, and their jobs have become increasingly difficult and really untenable. And so really, if we look at what the communities are asking for, it's the same thing police are asking for, right? Someone to handle these issues who's trained for that. They can be safer. The community can be safer. So really, if we can hear each other and start to make some steps, and for me, I think the steps come from the police department since they have the power, and I'm hoping to bridge that gap for small amounts. But I think if we can begin to make some of those steps, then we can begin to work together on getting our politicians and our leaders to provide this sort of funding for the solutions that we actually need, because police officers, police departments already know that arresting people is not solving problems. The community knows that arresting people is not solving problems. So let's come together, figure out what the solutions are, and fund them.
I think that's a great, impactful way to end. And I wish you all the best of luck in your term and all the things that you're setting out to accomplish. And thank you for coming on the Oregon Minute today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. Thank you for viewing this week's Oregon Minute. Tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m.